Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Scientists Share, which is a series of talks that the Save Muller campaign is organizing for researchers who worked in and around Goa to share their work with a wider audience. Today we have Anushka with us, who is a third-year PhD student at the Coupled Human Natural Systems Lab at Nanyang University in Singapore. My senior from NCBS, where she did her master's in wildlife conservation. Her research has been focusing around cashew plantations in southern Maharashtra, just outside Goa, and the socio-environmental impacts of these plantations. So I'll just say that it would be great if everyone mutes themselves. And if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And otherwise, yeah, Anushka, thanks for being here. And we can start.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you guys see?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Anushka and I'm going to be talking about my experiences working in the Western Ghats. So I'll be talking a little about my research so far during my master's and my PhD right now, and share some camera trap images, and this is just going to be a really informal talk. So when I tell people that I am a wildlife biologist and I work in forests, I often get this from them that, oh, you're so lucky. You get to work in pristine, dense forests that are just like far away from the people and far away from all the worldly cares. But really speaking, in the tropics and even in India, I don't think pristine, dense forests in the total sense really exist because land is a scarce resource. So more often than not, you'll see that forested spaces are really close to farmlands and agriculture, and people as well, who share space with the forest and the wildlife in these forests. So coming to the tropics, we see that humans and wildlife are interacting daily. And this is because land use conversion is one of the largest threats to biodiversity. So a lot of forests have been converted into agriculture in the tropics. And at the same time, these very same tropics are really biodiverse, but they're also highly productive for growing all sorts of crops. And it's equally important to grow these crops because we have to meet the global food demands. At the same time, we cannot really stop farmers from farming because it's a livelihood source for a lot of countries who are primarily agrarian economies. And land is a finite resource. So for sure, humans and wildlife interact with each other. And the concept of space and boundaries, the way we perceive it is really different from people, right? Sorry, wildlife, right? So what might be a boundary for us very clearly is not really a boundary for the wildlife. So while we might understand that, okay, wildlife should be in the forests and agriculture is just meant for people, wildlife doesn't perceive it like that. They don't have the same concepts of boundaries that we do. Also, globally speaking, protected areas are not enough. So the total land area under formal legal protection is only about 13%. And when it comes to strict biodiversity protection, it's even lower, it's 5.8%. So clearly this is not enough for all the wildlife in the world. And in a scenario like that, wildlife is bound to make use of agricultural spaces. And why not, right? Agricultural spaces might serve as an easy source of food, or they might just simply be in the way of the migration path of certain animals. So you have a few nice pictures here of elephants and leopards and tea plantations. The cirrus crane that visit rice fields in North India, or even hornbills, great hornbills that are really important. They're known as the farmers of the forest because they're seed dispersers for a lot of important tree species in the forest. And these birds also do come out in human modified landscapes. Now, if you're a wildlife biologist in training, like my batchmate sent me over here back in 2014 when we went to Periyar for a field trip, This is great. Like you just take out your binoculars and you watch the animals and you're really happy and you study their behavior and so on. But from the perspective of a lot of people who live in the tropics and do farming, this can be really stressful for them. And it's really stressful for the animals as well. So there's stress for both sides. There's a loss of livelihoods. There's a loss of lives in extreme cases. So it was very important for wildlife biologists to go out there and understand how do different animals, how do different groups of animals make use of agricultural spaces so that they could devise conservation strategies or mitigate the negative interactions between humans and wildlife. So we find from literature and from a bunch of studies done that the responses of different taxa, different animal groups, really vary according to their ecological needs. So, for instance, if you were to look at mammals, they might be sensitive to the distance from the main forest that they live in. So, for instance, in a study that was done in Bhadra Wildlife Sanctuary in Karnataka, we see that as you start moving away from the wildlife sanctuary, the number of species that are detected falls down. Then, if you were to look at butterflies and birds in a study in Southeast Asia, you see that the number of forest bird species and butterfly species is the highest in primary forest, which is a good quality habitat. And as you start moving towards logged forest and then rubber plantations and oil palm plantations, the numbers of both birds and butterflies start to fall. But responses don't just vary among taxa, but they also vary within taxa as well. So, for instance, if you were to look at different species of bats, they have different ecological requirements. And you can see that there is a wide variety of responses that the different bat species are giving, even though they're all broadly can be classified as bats. It's a little like if I were from Canada, I would not survive really well in the Singapore weather, which is like really humid. But I've lived in the humid areas before, so like it's okay for me to be in Singapore right now. So broadly, we can say that some of the key factors that we have seen to matter for monocultures to be used by wildlife as habitat. Some of them are the retention of native tree species, the distance from forest really matters to animals, and the extent of human management, how the farms are being managed, that really determines what kind of wildlife comes into these farms. What is also equally important is social data, because we might study the habitat use and the behavior of these animals, but unless you don't know what the community feels, what their motivations are, how they're managing their land, without that information, we cannot really hope to achieve much because it's these people in the end who live on these lands and decide what happens to the land. So the social data and the wildlife ecology data together can be used to come up with effective conservation strategies, which can be as much of a win-win as possible for both the parties. And this kind of research has been done quite a bit in certain kinds of crop types. So in oil palm, coffee, cocoa, a bit of tea. And one of the positive outcomes of this kind of research is the establishment of certain sustainability initiatives, which come up with certain social and environmental targets for these crop types. So for instance, I were a farmer growing coffee in the Western Ghats, and I agreed to be a part of one of these initiatives. I would have to agree to commit to certain behaviors that are wildlife friendly, but at the same time, also I have to be socially just. And if I do these things, then I get a good minimum price for my produce. So that's the way it works. And while it's been done for a lot of crops, and we know quite a bit now about how wildlife behaves in all of these crop types, there are still many crop types that are yet to be explored from this angle. So one such crop is cashew, and many of you might already know about cashew, like what the tree looks like. You might have been in plantations, but I'll just give some all of you a brief background. So cashew is an evergreen tree. It's found like it's native to Brazil, but it was introduced a long time ago throughout much of the tropics. So today there are about 32 countries in the world that grow cashew. And this is what, on your right hand side, there's the photo of the cashew nut with the pedicel or the false fruit, the yellow thing, which is used to make this liquor called feni. And in the end, you have this finished product that comes to your tables and supermarkets. So if you were to look at the total land area under cashew cultivation as of 2018, as you can see, a bunch of countries grow cashew, and to a large extent, it's the countries like India and a bunch of West African countries and Brazil as well. And then you also have Mozambique and Tanzania and Indonesia that grow quite a bit of cashew. They have quite a bit of land area under cashew harvest. And if you're not from a country that produces cashew, you're likely to be the hub of demand. So the US, a bunch of European countries, the Middle East, Singapore are major hubs of demand. And if you were to look at data from FAO data from 1961 to today, you see that the world area under harvest and the world production in terms of tons is just increasing steadily. And then there's, of course, the demand that comes from other countries that don't really grow the cashew. Coming closer to home, we have a bunch of states, mostly in peninsular India, that grow this crop. This map is slightly inaccurate because even Meghalaya has a lot of cashew plantations in the Garo Hills. But I don't really have conclusive data to present on this slide. But yes, it is the states of Maharashtra, Andhra that are the major producers. And Goa only comes lower on this list purely because the geographical area wise it's small. But actually, if you were to not consider admin boundaries, the whole South Maharashtra Goa region is one of the largest producers that produces top quality cashews. And then these are all the research-based academic motivations for studying wildlife in cashew. But from a very personal perspective, I also studied cashew because I saw it all around me growing up. So I mostly grew up with my maternal grandparents, and every vacation we would go back to our ancestral place in Goa. And I grew up seeing cashew orchards around me. So when I got into the masters and I studied about wildlife and different crop types like oil palm and coffee, it was only natural for me to wonder what was happening closer back home where we don't have so much of these crops, but we have a lot of cashew instead. So then for my masters, I asked how are terrestrial mammals using cashew? Are they even using cashew? And what are the factors that are affecting this habitat use? So I chose to focus on 4 different factors. Habitat type, understory cover, which is basically the amount of bushes, the bush undergrowth on the floor, forest floor or the orchard, wherever you are. And then also I looked at the distances from forest edge and nearest human settlement, which are landscape level features. So I decided to do this work in the Tillari region. So this is a map of the South Maharashtra Goa landscape. And the white box shows you the location of Tillari. So it's within the Dodamarg Taluka. And this entire region is a wildlife corridor between several protected areas like Radhanagari, Madei, the whole protected area belt in Goa really, and then Kali Tiger Reserve in Karnataka. And one might ask why we chose to do this in Tillari, and that's because it's one of the top cashew producers, I mean the whole landscape. And the forests are also owned mostly by people. And there's a fast conversion of forests into cashew. So cashew's traditionally been in this landscape for a really long time. But nowadays, a lot of people are cutting down vast patches of their forest to grow cashew and cultivar cashew particularly, which is like the clonal variety. So that's why we were really keen to do this in Tillari of all the places. So then the next question one might ask is how do wildlife biologists quantify habitat use? So what we do is, suppose this is my study site of interest, and then let's say the green is forest, and let's say the yellow is cashew, and I'm interested in looking at the habitat use of deer. So if I were to just look at the occupancy or how animals are occupying the landscape, where are they found? what I could do is I could divide my whole study area into grid cells, which are the size of their home range. So let's say this box is the home range of the animal. So I divide the entire study area into these little grid cells, these little boxes. And then I check whether the animal is detected there or not. My interest was to look at habitat use. So you divide the entire study area into at least the home range size or even smaller, ideally boxes, which are grid cells. And then in each grid cell, you visit the grid cell or you put a camera trap there and you repeatedly check if the animal was detected or not. And then you also collect data on a bunch of covariates or a bunch of variables that you're interested in looking at. So for me, it was these, like I had mentioned earlier. And this is a map of my study site. So I sampled in 100 grid cells. So here you have the different land uses. You have forests, you have cashew plantations. There's also some rubber cultivation in these areas, but we did not focus on that because the extent of these plantations is quite limited. So we did not sample in the rubber. And in each grid cell, we put 6 camera traps. And this way, we ended up sampling in 100 grid cells, of which 51 were in cashew plantations and 49 were in forest. And habitat use and understory cover, we went out into the field and we measured that. While distances from forest edge and human settlement, we used special softwares to calculate that. And here's a picture of me in the field with Girish, who was also a part of this project, and my field assistant, who's just great in the field. Like I got to learn so much from him. So that's the 3 of us. And these are all the species that we found in the landscape. So when I began working here, I would often go out just for walks, even before I began the study as a part of my pilot survey. And I would find some signs, some pellets, some dung here and there, but I didn't really see much in the cashew. So I was just wondering, like, am I even going to find any species in cashew? Because I'm putting in effort to walk in the plantations and put the camera traps, and sometimes they're like really high up there on the mountain, and you're just like, why am I doing this if I'm not going to get captured? But it was really great. I did not expect to even capture these many species, and we ended up finding these 11 species in the forests, out of which 9 were also found in cashew. So only mouse deer, which is on your left-hand side top, and muntjac, which is right bottom, diagonally across the mouse deer. So only these 2 species are the ones that we didn't really find in cashew. But all other species are found in cashew as well. So I'm just going to share a few pictures that we captured in our camera traps. So oh yeah, on your right hand side, there is a small key that shows you the relative size of the animal to an average human. So you have large carnivores, you have leopard, you have common palm civet, you have small Indian civet, you have Indian grey mongoose. Among the large herbivores, you have wild pig, you have sambar deer, you have gore. Among the small herbivores, we got the Chevrolet mouse deer and muntjac, barking deer. But these were only found in forest and not in cashew. And these 2 species were detected the least. And we can speculate that it was because of hunting, because these 2 species have been heavily hunted in the past, based on what we found out when we spoke to the locals. And then among the large rodents, we had the porcupine and the hare. We also found presence of other species that we didn't really get in the camera traps, which is understandable because our sampling season was pretty short, and we only conducted our sampling from January to April. But we also came across, so my focus was also terrestrial mammals, mammals on land who use land a lot. So there were species like langurs and macaques, and the langurs are really curious. So even when we would be walking in the forest, they would watch us, they would be really curious. And then I think after we left, they would come down and check out the cameras. So that was cool. They're really curious. Then we also saw wild dogs, we saw those. That was very memorable because we got to see them for almost 30 minutes, and it was just a great day. So this is one of the streams of Tillari, and we saw them during March. And then we had some memorable encounters. So like we would see wildlife often, but one incident that I particularly remember was when we had to retrieve camera traps on the last day of our fieldwork, and then we weren't finding the camera for some reason, like the GPS wasn't functioning properly. And then we finally saw the camera. But what we didn't realize for a split second is that there was a goer standing right behind that tree. So we waited there, we waited for like a good 5 minutes until that individual walked away, and then we retrieved the camera trap. Also, we had enough data to model the habitat use of these three species, the porcupine, sambar, and wild pig. So what we found was that porcupine and sambar both show comparable use of forest and cashew, while wild pig is actually showing more use of cashew over forest. And this is interesting for us because wild pig and porcupine have been reported to be habitat generalists from studies done elsewhere as well. But the sambar is usually considered a forest species. It prefers dense vegetation, is our understanding. So it was interesting to see that it showed use of cashew in the study. This is a picture of sambar next to a cashew plant tree. And then we also found that this covariate called distance from forest edge, it affected different species differently. So if you were to consider the wild pig, it's actually showing higher habitat use as you move away from the forest. So on the x-axis here, you have negative values. Okay, please ignore the zero on the far left. The zero in between means the forest edge, and the negative values mean you're inside the forest. That the zero on the left should actually be minus 0.8. And then the values on the right hand side mean you're away from the forest. So for the wild pig, as you moved away from forest, we saw that they're actually using the area more. While for porcupine, as you start moving away from the forest edge, the habitat use starts decreasing. Also, wild pigs that were closest, wild pig areas that were closest to the human settlement were used more by the wild pig. So as you moved away from people, the habitat use of wild pig also went down, which was quite an interesting observation. But we weren't surprised about this because wildlife also makes use of agricultural spaces elsewhere. So they are generalists, and across the world, really, they've been reported to make use of spaces near people, near agricultural areas. So then we started wondering if they were using cashew habitat as access to food resources or whether they were just moving around. And then we've also spoken to some locals who believe that wild pigs often bite into the cashew nuts that fall on the ground. So these are the samples that they showed me. And it could also simply be edge effect, which means that when the animal is near the edge of two different kinds of habitats, like forest and cashew in this case, they kind of prefer being by the edge as they get the best of both worlds. So it could simply be just that because we didn't have a large distance gradient to sample in, right? So the farthest distance we sampled away from the forest was about a kilometer. But that's just the way the landscape is. So we have to work with it. So this was what I did for my master's. And moving on in my PhD, I decided to kind of broaden the scope of this research. So now I'm working on evaluating the socio-environmental impacts of monoculture expansion of cashew in the Western Ghats. And I'm mostly focusing on the South Maharashtra Goa landscape. And we plan to do some spatial modeling to understand what areas are most suitable for cashew cultivation, and then understand what the biodiversity levels in these regions are to understand what is the risk involved. We also plan to look at land management practices by farmers to understand how people are managing the cashew forest landscape. We plan to look at biodiversity across cashew and forest. So really understand how is biodiversity using these lands and what species live where and why. And finally, we wish to come up with a map of deforestation for this landscape to understand what regions have experienced highest deforestation. So I'll just share with you all in brief the preliminary results or what we plan to do with these four objectives. So for mapping cashew suitability, this is a very preliminary result that I have as of now. But what we see is that predictably cashew suitability is the highest in the tropical region, where there's humidity, high rainfall, because these are the conditions that cashew prefers. But also we need to think about what biodiversity persists in these areas of high suitability. So that's going to be the next step that we take. And then we can kind of compare what regions need most conservation attention from this perspective. Then we also conducted interviews with cashew farmers to understand why are they converting most of their forested areas into cashew and at such a fast rate. So the pink triangles, they denote regions where we sampled, and the small black box near the Vega tag is really Tillari. So that's the region we were looking at for my master's. But now in the PhD, we're looking at a much larger landscape. And I've included North Goa in here because a part of our plan is to also interview farmers in Goa and look at the supply chain of cashew. And that was the plan for this year, but yeah, COVID, so hasn't happened so far. And what we found when we spoke to these farmers is that cashew has always been in the landscape, but this was the common variety of cashew. And a lot of farmers during the 80s realized that it was not as labor intensive as rice. So they also turned their rice farms into cashew. And then what happened is that around the 70s, at least in the Maharashtra side, and I am specifically saying Maharashtra because agricultural subsidies tend to be different and the state level agricultural department tends to make decisions differently. So for now, I just focus on Maharashtra. So what happens is that in the 70s, cultivar varieties start getting introduced in this landscape, and they fruit faster, they give you fast yields in a shorter amount of time. So all the farmers begin to plant and convert large patches of their forests into cashew. But they don't realize that these cultivar varieties are not as strong as the common ones. So they're more susceptible to pests, diseases. Also, they're not as strong as the common ones, so they get upturned by large wildlife such as gore and sambar. And then to compensate for this loss, one option is to go to the forest department and ask for compensation. But historically, the relationship between the forest department and people in this region has not been very good. They don't really trust the forest department as much. And because of this, to solve this issue, they end up planting even more cashew. This is actually like a really vicious cycle that just has no end, because to compensate the losses, they'll always be planting more and more and more. Also, when we spoke to the respondents, of the 65 respondents that we spoke to in Maharashtra, about 59% owned forested land. And mostly it's the small holders and the medium holders that own land, forested land. So by small holders, I mean farmers that have really small, within 2 hectares of agricultural land. And medium holders is farmers that have about 5 to 10 hectares of land and so on. And what they also said was that they do realize that forest clearing and deforestation is an issue, that we have lost so much forest, and that's probably contributing to a bad state of things. But they do have immediate concerns to look after, and they do have families to support. So they still say that they should have probably started growing a lot more cashew 10 years ago, but their eyes have opened now. Also, we asked them what are the species that they think are the most damaging for cashew. So most of the farmers across small, medium, and large holders, their farms are really close to cashew forest. But if you see, the larger your farm is, kind of the distance is farther away. But there's not much of a difference in this distance. It's really very minimal. So of all the species, they say that sambar, gore, porcupine, langurs and macaques and wild pig are the most damaging ones. And I put macaque and langur together for now because sometimes the farmers may not have a they may not make the distinction. They do recognize the two different species differently, but when they speak of them, they just like they say markers. So then we just put them in that one category for now. Then you have squirrel and peacock. And finally, very few people report species like hares, civets, elephants. Elephants come in that landscape during summertime. So elephants, manjak, rodents, bats. Next up, we want to look at avian diversity across the different land uses. So we started off with mammals, and now the idea is to look at bird diversity across cashew and forests. And the reason we want to do this is because they have many different guilds. So you might have trogons, which are considered forest specific species. So they might need dense vegetation or really good quality forest. Then you might have certain insectivores whose requirements are that they should have a food base, which are the insects. And then you might have raptors, birds of prey, like the crested serpent eagle, that requires good prey abundance, maybe vantage points. So different guilds or different groups of birds have different requirements. So a good quality habitat would have all of these requirements, and then that would in turn support a good diversity of birds. And finally, we also want to look at how these species are using sound. So I don't know if you can hear it, but this is some sound we have. So we've collected some acoustic data as well. And what we wish to understand is how saturated is sound in different landscapes, because each animal has a specific time and a specific frequency of calls. So just like land is a space that we study how animals use it, sound is also a niche or a habitat that can be studied. And finally, we want to come up with different maps based on information like where the factories are, where the towns are. And what we wish to understand is that where are the diverse deforestation hotspots and what factors are they influenced by? So is it that regions near markets are getting more deforested because people find it easier to transport the cashew for selling to the markets and so on? Also, this region is special not just because of all the science and the wildlife, but there's like so many amazing cultural references and stories that are there in this landscape. And I feel really lucky to have experienced these. So for instance, in Goa, if you will see, there's a presence of Vagoba shrines, which are mostly on hilltops, but recently people have also built them in more accessible places for the entire community or the entire village. So they have these Vagoba shrines, which have been around for decades and centuries, maybe even. Then there is a place in Tillari called Vagaza Dongar, which has a really fun story about how there is a cave in there and tigers always use the cave. And one day a farmer sees a tiger jump at his livestock to attack. But the farmer also feels, oh, I've strayed too far away from my village boundary. But the tiger falls to his death because he miscalculates the jump, which I also wonder if that could even happen to a cat, but it is an interesting story. Then on your right hand side, there's the Kasai mountain, Kasai Dongar, where devotees go up to the top to visit a temple every year. You have Myristica swamps in this region on the left bottom. So again, that's me and Akshata and my field assistant Kaka, who's standing between us. So the swamp is a region where people harvest just one tree per year for their holy bonfire, but otherwise they keep it largely untouched. And it's been around for a long time. And finally, really special to me is this celebration that happens in Goa, which is called Mange Thapni, and it's the fishermen come and they build this crocodile made out of the mud or the chikhol in the mangroves, and they decorate it with shells and flowers. And they believe that the crocodile is like the guardian of the water system, and that praying to it will get them good harvest of fish, and the waterways will be secure. And water is really the way of life in this region. So this year, earlier, I got an opportunity to see this. So that was really special to me because I actually went to my maternal ancestral place to see it. So that was very special for me as well. And finally, to sum this all up, this landscape really matters. It matters for a bunch of reasons. So it matters because, like I said before, boundaries are a superficial construct, and genetic connectivity, the movement of animals is really important. So animals do not understand the distinction between Maharashtra and Goa. They will just move from one forest to the other. And there are so many endemic species here, which means that they're only and only found in this region and nowhere else. There's a lot of connections of people with nature, and these are a really important. These forests are really important for the people. They recognize its value. And like I said before, water is the way of life in this landscape. So if you're protecting the forest, you're also protecting our water sources. And sometimes people also ask me like, are the forests in Maharashtra better or the forests in Goa better? But really, like I can't I can't pick a side. Like I'm just on the side of the animals because boundaries are superficial. It doesn't make sense. We need to get over that and start thinking of how we want to protect the entire landscape, the entire patch, right from South Maharashtra or right from Koyna and all the way down to South Goa, all the way down to Karnataka, so that animals can move around freely. And I think there's a lot that we still don't know about this landscape. So there's much to study. So we need to protect it because if we lose it at this point in time, we won't even know what we're going to lose. And with that, I end this talk. And I haven't been able to go to field work in the past couple of months, but I'm hoping that when I go there next, it's just going to look as good. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushka. That was a really, really interesting talk. So if anyone has any questions, please do type them in the chat box and I'll ask them. I have a couple. So I was just wondering, so, you talk about this really amazing connection between the people and the landscape in this area. So I was wondering, do people have a tolerance to these animals that come into the cashew plantations to eat the fruits? Or is there some hostility? What is the relation? What is that relationship like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. Based on my experience, what I've seen is that people are largely tolerant. It also depends on what their own economic status is, what their own personal feelings about wildlife are. What we see is that for some animals, they really are against it. So, for instance, elephants who started coming into this landscape in the past few years, but were not as much, didn't show much of a presence there before. For them, they're really scared or they don't want them in the landscape. But I also had the pleasure of talking to so many farmers who told me that it's okay, it's fine. Where are the animals going to go? It's us who are cutting down into their forest. So they're looking for food. So it's okay, like we understand. I think what their issue is that the forest department, uh, they perceive that the forest department is not being helpful because the current process is really difficult for them. The forest department is in Dodamar main town, and the amount that they spend in traveling to the forest department, getting the signatures of all the people that the land belongs to, by the time that whole process is done, you're spending as much as you're getting from the forest department as monetary compensation. So I just think the issue is that they're more upset with the way the compensation happens, but then sometimes the anger is directed at wildlife because they can't really direct the anger at government officials. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. So we have a question. Uh, if the water is so important, is there any information about how cashew plantations influence the water budget in the area? Are areas dominated by cashew drier or wetter than the forests?
Yeah. Yeah. Cashew generally does well in places even where you don't have much of water. So even if you don't really water the cashew, that's fine. Traditionally, common varieties of cashew have thrived without water throughout the year, except for when it rains. So that's the only source that they need. Uh, for cultivar cashew, which is coming up a lot more in the region, you do have farmers who water it during the first 3 to 4 years. Yeah. And do we have any information about cashew plantations and how they influence the water budget? No, we don't really have data as such. But yeah, I have noticed that the farmers tend to water the cultivar sometimes, not always, but sometimes during the first few years. Yeah. Our
We
areas
have another.
dominated by cashew dry. Oh, sorry, I'm just also going to answer this.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Well, our areas, not really. No, it's just one gradient of humidity and dryness and rainfall. Yeah, not much of difference. Yeah.
Okay, so you have another question. Is cashew intercropped with any other crops? Can it be grown in agroforestry systems with coffee or other wild tree species?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Thanks, Tuan. So, for sure, there are some people in this landscape who are trying to do that at the moment. So, we've met a bunch of farmers who are trying to intercrop cashew with millets, certain kinds of millets. So, they'll grow cashew. So, usually, cashew is grown in the 10-meter by 10-meter or 7 by 7 meter spacing in the landscape. So, what farmers are doing is they're kind of spacing the trees out a bit more and then planting millet around the cashew tree. Then there are some farmers who are also growing pepper. Uh, but the number of people who are doing that I've come across is just like three, four in total. Because one of the reasons people like to grow cashew is also because it's less intensive in terms of the investment of their effort. So when they plant it, they'll just plant cashew in a monoculture because then it will be easier to take care of it. You don't have to do much after the first few years. So, yeah.
So I was wondering, so there's like Black Bazaar, which is pushing to make coffee systems more sustainable. Are there any organizations that work in this like sustainability kind of outlook for cashew plantations?
Mhm. So no, at the moment, no. And when I started my PhD, that's something I wanted to study, very similar to Arshia Bose's work with coffee. Uh, but then I realized we don't even have baseline data about wildlife in cashew. So we can't even get to the sustainability part yet because we don't even know what wildlife is using cashew, what is happening. So then I stepped like it down a notch and I decided that sustainability things can happen later and first we need to generate baseline data. You do have Olam, which is like one of the major um, brands that works with different crop types. So they have a bunch of programs that ensure that cashew production is socially just. But nobody's really looking at the wildlife angle. And I do think we need a combination of both. Like one can't be without the other if you want to do proper conservation in the long term. Yeah.
Awesome. Akshay has a question. So there's been a lot of concern that some of these private forests in Tillari are being converted to rubber in response to global demand. Is there a push to convert cashew to rubber? Is this a component in your interview and global review component?
Yeah. So at the moment, no, because in the past few years, rubber prices in this region have actually gone down. So there are a couple of people, rubber plantation owners. They are in fact now not cultivating rubber in these patches. So it's mostly like leftover rubber, and they're trying to sell it off. But because the land patch is so huge, they're having trouble getting buyers. So no, as of now, no, but you never know. These markets fluctuate, right? So in the future, there could be more demand for rubber in this landscape. But it was not a component of my interview because I was just focused on looking at management of cashew and community forest. But when we speak to the farmers, we don't really keep a very streamlined way of interviewing them. So if they do share snippets about rubber land uses or even their experiences with reserve forests, how they make use of those areas, we do talk to them about that. And is it a global review component? Yeah, I do think globally, even though there's a demand in this landscape, it's kind of plateaued at the moment. No, whatever rubber is being cultivated now are plantations that were brought several years ago and now are being managed by those who can still afford to. But also a bunch of people have abandoned the plantations that they have. So it's just there, and we will see what happens. And there's also a second question, right?
Yeah, there's a second part. I'll just read it out. A recent study by a student from NCBS, Avishkar, found that cashew is nearly comparable in bird diversity to forests, but rubber is really bad for bird diversity. Do you suspect these patterns hold for other taxa? And is this something you're looking at in your study? And do you think these questions of rubber, cashew, and the differences between the plantations can be done using remote sensing tools?
Cool, nice questions. So I okay. So for the first part, do you suspect these patterns hold for other taxa? I think I really have no conclusive data, but based on what I've seen, my limited experience, I can say that I think it would be really interesting for amphibians, and because they have a whole bunch of requirements as compared to birds and mammals, right? So I think when it comes to amphibians, reptiles, and so on, I think it's going to be really cool because I think the forests are going to be much better for them, much better habitat, I mean. But no one's looked at that yet. So if there are any students out there who want to do this in the future, or any researchers, anyone who wants to look at this is what you can do. And is that something you're looking at? Not within the scope of my PhD, no. Uh, but I do plan to work in this region in the longer run. And I'm hoping that there'll be more people and more students and a lot more people that we can collaborate with in the future to generate data for these kinds of questions so that we can then start to think of what are the sustainable ways to make sure that both livelihoods and conservation is happening. And as far as remote sensing is concerned, that's actually one of the things we're doing in my PhD right now. So Janice, my PI, and there's another person we have on board called Smita. So we're trying to see how we can differentiate cashew from forest in this region. But it's a bit of a challenge because monocultures could be differentiated using a bunch of data sets. But the problem really comes when it's like the old growth cashew, which is the common cashew trees, and they are tougher to recognize even using remote sensing because some of them have been abandoned, some of them look really similar to forests. So that's like the issue that we're working on in our research right now. Yeah, cool questions. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. We have one more question. Do we have any data on habitat usage by wildlife in Andhra cashew plantations? If so, how does this compare to Maharashtra?
Um, I have not really come across a lot of work within Andhra. I've come across some things in from Kerala, yeah, but not so much from Andhra cashew plantations. And also in Andhra, the situation is slightly different because a lot of the cashew there is by the coast, so the habitat would be really different. Sometimes they would be near scrub forest, but a lot of times they would be wedged in the space between an urban area and the coast. So even in Orissa, I've seen a bit of wildlife within cashew, but it's kind of rare. Yeah.
Okay, and we have another one too. Do you
Sure.
think cashew is providing a food source to the wild animals that are using the plantations? And could it be a major food source in their diets?
Um, I don't think it would be a major food source because to begin with, cashew only fruits in a particular span of the year, which is like it starts from around Jan, and then the fruiting keeps happening until say April to mid May, and then for the rest of the year there is no cashew for the animals. So I wouldn't say it can be a major source, no. But I do think there is some kind of subsidizing that happens. We don't really have any footage that shows the animals are eating the cashews as such because the nut is encased with a really hard covering, right? But I did mention in the talk that some farmers report that the animals do kind of chew on the hard shell and then they just leave it like that. So that's kind of a loss for the farmers because once it's broken into, then they can't harvest it. But if it's intact and whole and if it's fallen on the ground, then they do harvest it. So yeah, there could be some kind of subsidizing, but I haven't really looked at that into detail. And that could be another cool project to like have these different plots and maybe some kind of enclosures and see if they are specifically going for cashew during flowering fruiting season. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we've answered all the questions. Thank you so much, Anushka, for being with us today and sharing your work.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for joining us and for all the questions. Thank you. There's a lot of appreciation. So it was a fantastic talk. So I'll end the talk now. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks
Thank you.
everyone for coming.